In 1611, a young Englishwoman boarded a ship to the New World, not for freedom nor fortune, but to be sold for 120 pounds of tobacco. This is the story of how survival, profit, and patriarchy turned marriage into a market and love into a transaction. Winter, 1609, Jamestown, Virginia. The wind howled across the skeletal remains of a dying colony. Frostbitten men clawed at tree bark for sustenance. Rats were trapped and boiled. And when even that was gone, the unthinkable happened. They dug up the dead. This was not a forgotten outpost. This was England's great experiment, its first permanent settlement in the New World. And it was unraveling faster than anyone back home could imagine. The winter of 1609 to 1610 would come to be known as the Starving Time. Of the 500 colonists who entered the season, barely 60 would emerge alive. The story of Jamestown didn't begin with failure. It started with profit. The Virginia Company of London, a joint stock venture, promised investors unimaginable returns from the riches of the New World. In 1607, it sent 104 Englishmen across the Atlantic. Gentlemen, soldiers, artisans, all men. Not a single woman was aboard that first voyage. They weren't building a society. They were hunting for gold. But there was no gold. And the land was not uninhabited. The Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of native tribes, controlled the region and regarded the English as both a curiosity and a threat. Early interactions were tense, but not immediately hostile. Still, the English encroached, built fortifications, and strained local relationships. Meanwhile, the colony floundered. Swampy terrain, brackish water, and outbreaks of dysentery and typhoid turned Jamestown into a death trap. Leadership was unstable, and food supplies were woefully inadequate. The men were not farmers. They were adventurers playing at an empire. By the time new ships arrived in 1609, the colony had swelled to around 500 people. But among them were still very few women, less than a dozen. The colony was male-dominated, and its social structure was crumbling. That fall, a resupply fleet wrecked in Bermuda, leaving the colonists with fewer resources than expected. As winter approached, the Powhatan, exhausted by English demands and aggression, cut off trade. Jamestown was trapped. That winter, desperation descended. Men ate dogs, cats, sand snakes, some boiled leather boots. One man was executed for killing and eating his wife. Skeletons unearthed centuries later revealed grim evidence. Skulls cracked open for marrow, bones butchered in patterns that spoke not of survival, but of hunger's madness. The colony nearly vanished. But this is where the story turns, and where the logic behind buying brides begins to take shape. In 1610, the wrecked Bermuda fleet finally arrived with new leadership and supplies. Among them was Sir Thomas Gates, who found the settlement in ruins. Gates ordered an evacuation, but as they sailed down the James River, they were met by another relief fleet led by Lord De La Warr, with fresh soldiers, food, and orders to hold the colony. Jamestown had narrowly escaped oblivion, but its survival raised a deeper question. What were they surviving for? The Virginia Company had learned its lesson. If England wanted a permanent colony, it needed to build a society, not just a trading post. A population of single men, fighting hunger and disease, with no women, children, or families, was not sustainable. And so, the mission changed. Jamestown would not just be a commercial outpost. It would become an English town in the wilderness, a place of marriage, farming, family, and order. But where would the women come from? The logic was chilling in its clarity. The company needed to stabilize the colony, and men needed reasons to stay. If they could not bring English women voluntarily, they would incentivize them to come. Promise them land, status, and security. Dress it as an opportunity. Frame it as patriotism. What emerged was not a romantic vision, but a transactional one. Women would be recruited, shipped, and effectively sold as wives for 120 pounds of tobacco, the currency of the New World. But this was still a few years away. First, the colony had to survive, and for that, it needed something even more potent than English steel or a royal charter. It needed a plant. In 1611, a settler named John Rolfe planted a strain of tobacco from the Caribbean. It was sweeter, more fragrant than the harsh native variety. By 1612, the first Virginia-grown shipment had reached England and caused a sensation. Tobacco became Jamestown's salvation. It would fuel an economy, attract settlers, and feed the dream of empire. But it also became something darker, a symbol of human value. It was this plant, bitter on the lungs and golden in the ledger, that would become the bride price. Back in the colony, a transformation was beginning. Fields of tobacco replaced dreams of gold. Wooden homes were rebuilt, forts rearmed, and behind it all, a new ideology was taking root. One that saw women not as citizens or settlers, but as civilizers, tools of order, bearers of English identity. To tame the land, they believed, they had to tame the men. And to tame the men, they needed wives. But in a colony where survival was a gamble, what kind of woman would risk it all to cross the sea? For a husband, that answer, and the system it built, would soon redefine marriage, gender, and economics in colonial America. It didn't glitter like gold, but it burned like power. By 1612, a Caribbean strain of Nicotiana tabacum, planted in Virginia soil, began to alter the future of the English colony forever. What was once a fragile outpost on the brink of starvation became a booming enterprise, fueled by a plant that stained fingers and filled coffers. Tobacco didn't just save Jamestown, it redefined its values and became the currency of love. The man behind this transformation was John Rolfe, a quiet but ambitious settler who arrived in Virginia aboard the wrecked Sea Venture in 1610. Rolfe had brought with him seeds of Spanish tobacco, smuggled illegally from the Caribbean, where its cultivation had already turned into a lucrative industry. The native tobacco in Virginia was coarse, bitter, and unpopular in England. But the Caribbean variety, lighter, sweeter, and smoother, proved intoxicating to European markets. Rolfe's first experimental crop in 1612 was modest. His second, in 1613, made waves in London. By 1617, the colony had exported over 20,000 pounds of tobacco. By the 1620s, that number would swell into the hundreds of thousands. Tobacco was no longer a novelty. It was a gold mine. But this prosperity had a price. To meet rising demand, colonists cleared vast tracts of land along the James River, pushing into native territory and increasing tensions with the Powhatan. Forests were burned. Fields were carved from wilderness. The colony began to sprawl outward, not as a community, but as a plantation economy. Tobacco farming was labor-intensive. Planting, harvesting, drying, and shipping required constant attention. Every man with a hoe became a small businessman, and every business person needed capital, not in coins or silver, but in the crop itself. Soon, tobacco became currency. It was used to pay taxes, settle debts, purchase supplies, and, in one of the most startling turns, to buy wives. The logic was transactional, but clear. As tobacco profits rose, the Virginia Company recognized two problems. First, many colonists were refusing to settle down. They worked, harvested, and often returned to England. Second, those who stayed lacked structure. And in the English mind, structure meant marriage, household, and law. The company believed that permanent colonists needed emotional and moral investment in the land. Family would anchor them, and for that, they needed women. But women were in short supply. Fewer than 200 English women lived in Virginia by 1619. That same year, The colony's male population had ballooned to nearly 1,200. The imbalance was dramatic and dangerous. A solution was needed. And, as with everything else in the New World, the solution would be economic. In 1620, the Virginia Company began a bride recruitment campaign in England. It promised adventure, security, and opportunity. For women with limited prospects in England's crowded towns, many of them orphans, widows, or daughters of the lower classes, the offer was tempting. But there was a price. Colonial men would reimburse the Virginia Company 120 pounds of tobacco for each bride, roughly the equivalent of a year's wages. This fee covered the cost of the woman's voyage, her clothing, and an implied dowry. 120 pounds. That was the market rate of a wife. To the company, this wasn't exploitation. It was innovation. The brides were volunteers, not prisoners. They were promised land, social status, and a choice of husbands upon arrival. They weren't auctioned. They were courted. Yet the transactional framework was impossible to ignore. They were investments in stability, assets of domesticity. Tobacco had transformed the very idea of courtship. For the men of Virginia, these brides were more than romantic partners. They were symbols of success. Owning land and affording a wife became marks of masculinity. The ability to pay 120 pounds of tobacco was proof that a man had made it. The colony's social ladder hardened. Men who had tobacco gained wives. Those who didn't remain alone. As one observer noted, none but the most industrious may purchase them. Marriage had become a marketplace, and the currency was a plant. This commodification of women, while wrapped in the language of family and virtue, mirrored the colony's larger transformation. Everything in Jamestown was becoming quantifiable. Labor, land, life, even love. And tobacco was at the center of it all. But there were more profound consequences. As the colony expanded its tobacco fields, it began consuming more labor than it could sustain. The 1620s saw a rise in indentured servitude. Poor English laborers bound by contracts, but tobacco's hunger would not stop there. Within a few decades, the same system that priced wives in leaves would turn to human bondage. The institutionalization of African slavery. The seeds of commodified marriage were planted alongside the seeds of racialized labor. Tobacco blurred the boundaries between necessity and morality. It fed empires, but it also warped values. What began as a lifeline for a starving colony became the yardstick by which everything and everyone was measured. In this brave new world, where soil was wealth and survival was uncertain, tobacco didn't just buy comfort. It bought people. And among the first were the women who crossed an ocean, not for love, but for 120 pounds of golden leaves. In the bustling alleys of early 17th century London, a quiet crisis brewed beneath the surface of the empire. It wasn't about politics or trade routes. It was about women, thousands of them, unmarried, underemployed, and largely unwanted. By 1620, England had a surplus of single women. Some were widowed by plague. Others had no dowries and thus no prospects. They worked as servants, laundresses, or sewists, often barely surviving. In a patriarchal society where a woman's worth was measured by marriage and motherhood, those who remained single were branded with a cold word: spinster. England's rigid social hierarchy left little room for female independence. Most women had no legal identity outside of a husband or father. Property and inheritance passed through the male line. The best a poor woman could hope for was a stable marriage. The worst, abandonment, poverty, or prostitution. And in England's growing cities, the worst was becoming common. London, York, and Bristol teemed with women in limbo. The enclosure movement had displaced thousands from rural villages, driving them into cities that were overcrowded and unforgiving. crime rose, orphanages overflowed, and charity could not keep up with demand. For the ruling elite, unmarried women were not just a moral concern, they were a social threat. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another imbalance was reaching a boiling point. In the Virginia colony, men outnumbered women nearly 6 to 1. The lack of families made the settlement unstable. Colonists fought, drank, and drifted without purpose. The Virginia Company knew that if the colony were to endure, it needed roots. And roots meant wives. The company saw an opportunity. Solve 2 crises with one scheme: recruit England's surplus women and export them to the New World. The plan was bold, but calculated. The Virginia Company began advertising in churches, marketplaces, and ports, targeting young, single women of modest birth and honest disposition. Recruiters offered more than just marriage. They promised adventure, land, upward mobility, and, above all, choice. Upon arrival, the women could choose their husbands from among the eligible men. They would receive clothing, tools, and even partial ownership of their household. Unlike in England, where dowry determined fate, these women would hold rare leverage. It was marketed as a chance to escape the constraints of class, to become pioneers of a new society. But behind the promises lay a stark truth. These women were being sent to marry strangers in a wild and dangerous land in exchange for a cash crop. Even though they signed voluntary contracts, the circumstances were hardly equal. Most were impoverished. Some were orphans. Others were fleeing abusive homes or the limited choices of a rigid patriarchy. Their names have largely faded from history. But records show women like Jane Dyer, Susan Richardson, and Alice Burgess, some as young as 15, left behind everything they knew. Some came alone. Others boarded the ships in small groups, linked by faith or desperation. Before departure, they were outfitted by the Virginia Company with gowns, shoes, linens, and religious instruction. They signed agreements acknowledging their purpose to marry and to help build a moral Christian colony. The voyages themselves were perilous. Months at sea meant exposure to storms, hunger, and illness. Some ships never made it. Others arrived with only half their passengers alive. Still, the company pressed forward, determined to reshape the colony through domesticity. When the women arrived in Jamestown and other settlements, they were met with ceremony and calculation. Men lined up to present their case. A good harvest, a sturdy home, a kind disposition. All were bargaining chips in the marriage market. While women technically had the power to choose, societal pressure, survival, and isolation often narrowed their options. Still, for some, the arrangement worked. Letters sent back to England describe happy unions, new homes, and even a sense of freedom. For others, life in Virginia was harsher than imagined. Illness, violence, and domestic abuse plagued the settlements. Some women were widowed within weeks. Others married men who viewed them less as partners and more as laborers or property. The company made little provision for women who refused to marry or who regretted their choices. The program was not universally celebrated. Critics in England accused the Virginia Company of treating women like commodities. Religious leaders warned of moral corruption. But the company responded with a different message. These were not sales. They were sacrifices for civilization. Marriage, the company claimed, was the cornerstone of Christian society. The women were not being sold. They were being honored as the saviors of the New World. Their wombs would produce Englishmen. Their presence would tame the wildness of the frontier. It was a spiritual mission, a patriotic duty, and a business transaction. By 1622, a second group of tobacco brides was dispatched. The precedent had been set. Jamestown began to look more like an English town. Children were born. Churches were built. Social norms hardened. But the deeper implications of the program echoed far beyond marriage. It established a precedent that gender, like land or labor, could be priced and moved across oceans, that women could be incentives, that family could be engineered. And in the name of civilization, a system had emerged where choice was illusion and survival was transaction. It began with a letter, or a whisper, in a London alley. A young woman, perhaps 17 or 18, was offered a choice: stay in a country that gave her no future, or set sail for a land she had never seen, to marry a man she had never met, in exchange for a life she had only heard about in pamphlets and prayer. By 1620, the Virginia Company's plan was in full motion. The first shipments of respectable maids were being organized for export, not for labor in the fields, but for marriage. The company didn't call them wives for sale. They called them maidens for planting, and they were packaged, transported, and delivered like cargo. The process was deceptively formal. Women were screened, interviewed, and in some cases, interrogated about their morality, health, and intentions. They were expected to be of good character and capable of bearing children. They weren't criminals or prostitutes, at least not officially. They were, in theory, the mothers of a new civilization. Many came from humble backgrounds, daughters of blacksmiths, weavers, laborers. Some were orphaned, others simply unmarried. In a world where a woman's future was pinned to the fortunes of a husband, this was an escape hatch from economic invisibility. Each woman signed a contract. In return for her passage across the Atlantic, she agreed to marry a colonial settler of her choosing, though choice was rarely straightforward. In exchange, the colonist would pay the Virginia Company 120 pounds of tobacco, covering her travel, clothing, and presumed dowry. To the company, this was business. To the women, it was hope and risk. The voyages were brutal. Aboard cramped wooden ships like the Charity, Seaflower, and George, the women sailed from English ports, often in winter, across the treacherous North Atlantic. Storms, illness, and malnutrition were constant threats. Scurvy and dysentery could sweep through a ship before it reached Bermuda. Some died before ever seeing the New World. Others arrived sick, weak, or traumatized. For many, the passage alone felt like survival training. Yet when the ships arrived, usually in Jamestown or smaller outposts like Henricus, the women were welcomed not with ceremony, but with calculation. The colonists, many of whom had paid or promised large sums in tobacco, had been waiting. The selection process began almost immediately. It wasn't an auction, at least not openly, but it mirrored one. Each woman was introduced to a group of eligible men. These men, often farmers, artisans, or soldiers, would make their case. They spoke of their land, their homes, their future. For once, women held something rare: leverage. But the illusion of choice had limits. The colony was dangerous. Refusing a suitor might mean isolation. Accepting the wrong man could mean hardship or abuse. The Virginia Company offered little protection after the transaction was made. There were no courts for unhappy matches, no second chances. Most women married within weeks of arrival, some within days. 120 pounds of tobacco. That was the cost. Not paid to the woman, but to the company that delivered her. A heavy sum, but one many men were willing to pay. Because wives were more than partners, they were symbols of stability. A married man was seen as settled, domestic, productive. He was more likely to be granted land, to be expected by neighbors, and to be supported by the church. Marriage, in the harsh eyes of colonial administration, turned lawless settlers into citizens. And for the men, wives brought more than children. They brought labor. They cooked, gardened, nursed, cleaned, and maintained order in a world that offered none. To a lonely tobacco planter on the edge of the wilderness, a wife meant civilization. Some women adapted quickly. They formed communities, attended church, and raised families. Letters sent back to England, likely curated by the company, painted glowing images of contented wives and fertile fields. These letters were used to recruit more women, spinning hardship into opportunity. But the truth was less romantic. Many women died young, from childbirth, fever, or violence. Others were widowed within months. Some were forced into second or third marriages. Legal protections for women were almost non-existent. Domestic abuse was rarely punished, and remarriage was often encouraged for widows, not out of compassion, but to ensure productivity. In some cases, women disappeared from the record. Still, the program expanded. The first cohort of brides arrived in 1620. A second followed in 1621. Over the next few years, nearly 300 women were shipped to the colony under this system. The Virginia Company celebrated the program's success as evidence of social growth. English customs, from Sabbath church attendance to traditional gender roles, began to take hold. The colony was transforming from a masculine outpost into a structured, if still fragile, society. But behind the progress was a darker foundation: the commodification of marriage. The brides were not enslaved. They were not shackled. They signed papers willingly. But the system that brought them across the sea saw them as a means to an end. They were tools of social engineering. Their value was measured in tobacco, their success in birth rates. And though the company cloaked it in morality and patriotism, the logic was unmistakable. Marriage in the New World had a price, and the women who bore that burden were both its architects and its victims. She stepped off the ship with a bundle of linen and a letter of consent. Behind her, the Atlantic. Ahead, a rough wooden house, a husband she had never met, and fields of tobacco stretching into the pine woods. This was not romance. It was a new kind of reality. One born from the ashes of starvation and sold by the pound. For the women who became tobacco wives, the promise of a better life collided quickly with the harsh truth of survival. The average Englishwoman in the early 1600s might have spent her days sewing, baking, or tending a modest garden. But Virginia was no English village. In Jamestown and its outlying plantations, women labored as hard as the men, often harder. They rose with the sun, lit the fires, and prepared food from scratch. They hauled water from rivers that were sometimes frozen, sometimes brackish. They sewed every garment. They nursed the sick when doctors were absent, which was often the case. And if their husbands fell ill or died, they took over the fields. Marriage was supposed to provide security. But in a colony where every winter could bring death and every forest trail could hide an ambush, security was a luxury few truly knew. Despite the promotional materials printed in London, life as a tobacco wife was neither leisurely nor gentle. It was work, physically punishing, emotionally isolating, and spiritually exhausting. The women were expected to fulfill multiple roles: domestic laborers, nurses, teachers, midwives, moral compasses, and, most importantly, mothers. Childbearing was a civic duty in the eyes of the Virginia Company. More births meant more colonists. But pregnancy was also a gamble. Medical knowledge was crude. Many women died giving birth. Many children died shortly after. Records from the period are sparse, but suggest that infant mortality could reach 50% or more. Some women bore 5, 6, even 10 children, only to bury most of them before their own death in their 30s or early 40s. Still, there were success stories. Some women formed close bonds with neighbors. In tight-knit settlements, they built networks of mutual aid, sharing food, assisting with births, and helping one another survive. For women who had known only poverty or servitude in England, Virginia sometimes offered unexpected freedom. Men still held land, but widows could inherit property. a rarity in England. In fact, a few tobacco wives became wealthy widows, managing estates and negotiating with merchants in their husband's absence or after their deaths. These were the exceptions, but they did exist. But even within this harsh system, not all unions were miserable. Some marriages, though arranged for economic reasons, blossomed into true partnerships. Men who treated their wives as equals, or at least as valuable contributors, often found their households more stable. And for women who had escaped abusive families, crowded tenements, or the ever-looming threat of prostitution in English cities, Virginia, despite its dangers, could feel like a brutal kind of freedom. It was not love in the romantic sense, but it was a purpose. And for many, purpose was enough. Still, beneath every domestic scene lay the invisible thread of transaction. Tobacco had paid for her. Her husband may have saved for years to afford the fee. The weight of that debt, literal and symbolic, shaped expectations. Some men saw their wives as investments, not partners. If the wife failed to produce children or resisted her role, it could be seen not just as a personal failure, but also as a financial one. There were few legal protections for women in the early decades. Domestic abuse, while condemned in theory, was rarely punished. Divorce was nearly impossible. A woman who attempted to flee her husband risked homelessness, imprisonment, or worse. Choice, once promised at the docks, quickly narrowed. Religion reinforced the status quo. The Anglican Church, deeply woven into colonial life, preached obedience and hierarchy. Wives were expected to submit to husbands. Husbands were expected to rule with firmness and piety. Ministers often spoke of women as helpmeets, necessary but secondary. The Tobacco Bride program had been framed as a moral crusade, bringing Christian order to a chaotic wilderness. But in practice, it turned women into instruments of stability, less valued for their minds than for their capacity to reproduce and maintain order. Even love was supposed to serve the colony. And yet, amid the hardship, some women endured, even thrived. Their letters, though few, tell stories of hope, of gardens growing from cleared forest, of children born strong, of families slowly stitched together on foreign soil. They weren't saints. They weren't martyrs. They were survivors. And their labor, physical, emotional, reproductive, built the first permanent English society on the American continent. Today, their names are mostly forgotten. Their homes burned beneath suburban Virginia or were lost to rivers and rot. But their legacy remains in the most foundational institution of American life, the household. They came for a better life. They arrived as cargo. They were bought in tobacco. But they birthed the future. And in doing so, they changed the very meaning of marriage in a colonial world. In the early 1600s, the Virginia wilderness was not just a place of economic ambition. It was a battlefield of moral anxiety. To the English mind, the New World was a land of promise and peril. It was fertile, wild, and frighteningly free. Without towns, bishops, or courts, it seemed vulnerable to chaos, not just political, but spiritual. So the Virginia Company did what every empire does when facing instability. It turned to religion and law, and both would become tools, not only to tame the land, but to justify the sale of wives. The Anglican Church, deeply intertwined with the English state, had long preached a strict vision of social order. God was at the top, kings beneath him, then noblemen, landowners, husbands, and, finally, women and children. This divine hierarchy was not just a metaphor. It was law, custom, and expectation. Marriage was the cornerstone of this system, not an act of love, but an act of obedience to God, to husband, to nation. And in the untamed colonies, that obedience needed reinforcement. From the beginning, Virginia's colonial leaders saw the lack of women not only as a logistical problem, but as a moral crisis. A colony filled with single men was, in their view, vulnerable to sin, drunkenness, violence, laziness, and lust. Without wives, men drifted. Without families, laws were weak. Without mothers, children, and therefore civilization, could not be raised. To prevent the colony from descending into moral rot, the Virginia Company presented the Tobacco Bride program not as commerce, but as a Christian rescue. They were not selling women. They were restoring order. Pamphlets distributed in English churches described the brides as young and uncorrupted. Preachers encouraged parishioners to donate clothing for the departing women. Sermons spoke of the colonists' duty to be fruitful and multiply, to spread the English faith as well as the English flag. Even the term used by company officials, planting maids, invoked Genesis. These weren't transactions, they argued. They were sacraments. Women were not being shipped across the sea as property, but as sowers of godly virtue. The logic was clear. To Christianize the colony, you must domesticate it. And to domesticate it, you must marry the men. Of course, beneath the scripture lay strategy. The Virginia Company knew the colony was teetering. Disease, starvation, and native resistance had made investors nervous. Profits were slow. They needed a new story, one that would reassure England that Virginia was not just surviving, but becoming civilized. Wives were the proof. By showcasing weddings, baptisms, and Sunday services, the company could present the colony not as a desperate outpost, but as a blossoming Christian society. Each bride wasn't just a wife. She was a propaganda victory, a quiet symbol of order in a land once ruled by chaos. But while religion wrapped the program in virtue, control remained the driving force. Once married, a tobacco bride's autonomy disappeared almost entirely. Under English common law, a wife had no separate legal identity. Her husband owned the land, the household, and, in many ways, her. Even her body was not entirely her own. Refusing conjugal relations could be grounds for punishment or annulment. A woman who disobeyed her husband could be whipped, shamed, or expelled, not just from the home, but from the entire community. And in the colony, far from courts and family, those rules could become deadly. Colonial leaders enforced strict codes to maintain what they called godly discipline. Women were required to attend church, remain chaste before marriage, and display obedience after. Adultery by a wife could be punished with public shaming, or worse. There were no shelters for abused women, no divorce courts, no advocates. Some women tried to resist. Records tell of a few who fled their husbands, refused suitors, or demanded return to England. Most were silenced. A few were jailed or forcibly remarried. Others disappeared from the record, their stories lost in the silence of the wilderness. And yet, the moral justification endured. To colonial authorities, these women had not been commodified. They had been saved. They were brought from poverty into purpose, from sin into sanctity, from the gutters of London into the halls of Christian duty. It was an illusion, but a powerful one, because it allowed the colony to mask its exploitation in the name of virtue. And for centuries, that illusion would persist. Even today, the Tobacco Bride program is often remembered as a curious footnote, an experiment in frontier matchmaking. Rarely is it framed as what it truly was, a system of gendered control, wrapped in the language of God and nation, enforced by economic pressure and social silence. But the women knew. In letters, in pleas, in the small acts of resistance we glimpse through scattered documents, they knew the cost. They were not brides in the way we imagine them. They were anchors, symbols, and sometimes sacrifices. In the name of morality, they were bound. In the name of order, they were controlled. Not every man in the Virginia colony could afford a bride, and not every man was allowed one. Behind the headlines of tobacco brides and matrimonial experiments lay a more profound truth. The marriage market in colonial America was not only gendered, it was racialized and class-bound. Only certain men were deemed worthy of wives. Only certain women were considered fit to marry. And behind every pairing, every contract, and every ceremony loomed a quiet hierarchy, one that would define centuries of American social structure. By the early 1620s, the Virginia Company had begun sending waves of English women to the colony, but always with conditions. A woman had to be of good character, preferably from a modest but respectable background, and, crucially, white. No indigenous women were recruited. No African women were included. And while elite gentlemen could sometimes choose from among the best of the brides, poor laborers and indentured servants rarely stood a chance. Marriage, even in the New World, was still a matter of status. The program's cornerstone, the 120-pound tobacco payment, was more than a fee. It was a filter. That amount, equivalent to over a year's wages for many, ensured that only landowning men, or those with promising prospects, could participate. These were men with land, with crops, and with some degree of social standing. For people with low incomes, marriage remained a hope, not a guarantee. And for indentured servants, often young men who sold years of their labor in exchange for passage, marriage was off the table entirely. Most were forbidden to marry until their terms of service ended, often years into their colonial life. By then, many were physically broken, destitute, or simply dead. Even more excluded were the growing number of African laborers in the colony. The first documented Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, just 1 year before the slave ships. Initially classified as indentured servants, some gained freedom after years of labor. But even these free black men, a minor and temporary class, were barred from participating in the marriage market of English tobacco brides. No official law prohibited it at first. It didn't need to. The entire system was designed to preserve a racialized English identity through reproduction. The colonial authorities wanted not just marriages, but English families, white women giving birth to white children, the next generation of settlers, taxpayers, and landowners. Introducing race into that equation disrupted their vision of a pure colonial society. Indigenous women, meanwhile, lived on the edge of that vision, both desired and feared. In the early years of contact, Englishmen occasionally took native women as wives or concubines, sometimes through informal unions, sometimes through coercion. These relationships were tolerated, mainly when used to gain alliances or access to resources. But they were never encouraged. The one major exception, the most famous indigenous woman in early American history, was Pocahontas. Her marriage to John Rolfe in 1614 was not a love story. It was a diplomatic strategy. Pocahontas, daughter of Powhatan's paramount chief, had been kidnapped by the English and held for ransom. During her captivity, she converted to Christianity, took the name Rebecca, and was eventually married to Rolfe, the very man who had launched the colony's tobacco economy. English officials celebrated their union as a triumph of civilization over savagery. In London, Pocahontas was paraded as a symbol of successful colonization. The tamed native woman married into English society. But she died young, never returning to her homeland. And her marriage became more myth than model. It did not open doors for other indigenous women. It closed them. By the late 1620s, the Virginia colony was drawing sharper racial and class lines. African laborers were increasingly treated not as servants, but as lifelong enslaved people. Laws began to codify differences between Christian and heathen, free and bond, white and black. The marriage market followed suit. White English women were reserved for white English men, preferably those with land, crops, and prospects. Poor white men waited or went without. Black and indigenous men were barred entirely. And women of color? They were never even asked if they wanted to marry. Even among the English, the system stratified. Well-connected colonists could afford more desirable brides. Men who had risen from poverty through hard work might still find themselves rejected. Not because of lack of character, but lack of social standing. Marriage was supposed to stabilize the colony, but it also reinforced the very inequalities it claimed to overcome. The bride price, 120 pounds of tobacco, was rarely questioned. But its implications were profound. It meant that access to family, reproduction, and stability was not a right, but a privilege, a commodity. Only those who could pay would be permitted to build families. Only those who conformed to English race, class, and gender expectations would be allowed to plant roots. And this quiet sorting of human value would echo across American history. From anti-miscegenation laws to property-based marriage rights to the racialized politics of family planning in centuries to come. The women of the Tobacco Bride program were not asked to weigh in on this system. Many likely never fully understood its implications. They came for survival, for hope, for escape. But they entered a world where their very presence reinforced a hierarchy, one that measured worth by skin color, health, and lineage. And their wombs, in the eyes of colonial leaders, were not just vessels for children. They were factories for the empire. The records are mostly silent, but here and there, in court proceedings, in censored letters, in hastily amended contracts, cracks begin to appear in the official story. The Tobacco Bride program was sold as a solution, a triumph of morality and matchmaking. But the truth on the ground was far messier. And not every woman accepted her fate quietly. Some resisted, some vanished. The women who boarded ships bound for Virginia may have signed contracts, but not all did so freely. Recruitment efforts in English cities often blurred the line between opportunity and coercion. Some women were misled about the conditions in the colonies. Guardians, parishes, or financial desperation pressured others. Once aboard, they were trapped. There was no turning back after the sails were raised, and when they arrived, many found a harsh awakening. The rugged settlements bore little resemblance to the orderly English towns described in pamphlets. The men were sunburnt, blunt, and often far older than promised. Some barely spoke. Others expected obedience on sight. In such a setting, consent became slippery. Some women refused to marry. Company officials, anxious to keep up the appearance of success, were caught off guard. In one recorded instance from 1621, a young woman named Alice Barlow declined every suitor presented to her over several weeks. Her reasons aren't known, only that local leaders labeled her rebellious and threatened to withhold rations if she continued to refuse. Others negotiated, demanding land guarantees, better accommodations, or protection clauses in their marital arrangements. Occasionally, they succeeded, but often, such demands were met with suspicion or punishment. In a colony starved for women, defiance was dangerous. There were also stories of flight. Women who, after marrying, attempted to escape abusive husbands or unbearable conditions. Some fled into the woods. Others tried to board outgoing ships, bribing sailors or disguising themselves as men. The consequences were severe. A woman caught escaping her husband's household could be returned by force or imprisoned. One court record from 1623 describes a maid wife found hiding in a tobacco barn after being away for 3 nights. She was beaten, shamed publicly in the stocks, and remanded to her husband's authority. Her name was never recorded. Even within marriages, some women resisted silently, through non-compliance, through alliances with other women, or through subtle sabotage. Some refused to bear children, knowing that pregnancy would bind them permanently. Others withheld labor, feigning illness or incompetence. A few even turned to poisoning, an act viewed not just as criminal, but treasonous in a world where wives were expected to be caretakers. Most such stories never made it into official documents, but scattered rumors, folk tales, and passing mentions in letters suggest a quiet undercurrent of female rebellion. Small, invisible acts of defiance in a world built to suppress them. The Virginia Company, alarmed by the risks to its fragile social order, responded with increasing control. Later, bride shipments were subjected to stricter contracts. Some women were assigned chaperones. Others were only allowed to marry men pre-approved by local officials. Warnings were issued to colonists. Any mistreatment of a wife might discourage future recruits. But few protections were truly enforced. Once a woman married, she became a private possession rather than a public charge. Abuse, isolation, and abandonment were common and rarely punished. The colonial authorities valued wives as tools rather than individuals. Some women fought back through the legal system. In rare cases, tobacco wives brought grievances before local magistrates, claiming broken promises, fraud, or cruelty. One 1624 case records a woman who petitioned to annul her marriage because her husband had misrepresented his wealth and health. The court ruled in her favor, a rare victory in a system tilted against her. But such cases were exceptional. The vast majority of women had no access to legal redress, especially if they were poor, illiterate, or isolated. Resistance remained a lonely battle. Still, the cracks spread. By the late 1620s, enthusiasm for the tobacco bride program was waning. Letters sent back to England began to reveal the darker side of life in Virginia. Complaints circulated about mistreatment, poverty, and deception. Some women who returned home, or who had sisters still in England, warned others not to sign the company's contracts. Recruitment became harder. The company tried to counter the bad press by publishing glowing testimonials, likely ghost-written, praising the colony's morality and opportunities. But rumors proved harder to silence than sermons. Eventually, the program faded, not just because of resistance, but because the colony itself was changing. As more English families arrived and as children were born in Virginia, the urgency for imported brides diminished. The economy shifted, and with it, the logic of social engineering. But the legacy of the tobacco wives and their quiet rebellions would remain. They were not simply settlers. They were commodified, contracted, and often controlled. But their resistance, quiet, dangerous, and often invisible, reminds us that even in the darkest corners of empire, there was agency, there was will, and there was courage. By the mid-1620s, the bride ships slowed. No announcements, no official decree. Just fewer names on the lists. Fewer women are stepping onto colonial docks. Fewer transactions are measured in leaves of cured tobacco. The program that once symbolized the Virginia Company's vision, marriage as a colonial tool, wives as stabilizing currency, began to vanish. Not with scandal, but with a quiet shift in priorities. The tobacco bride era was ending, and the reasons stemmed from the colony's transformation. The first and most pressing reason was demographic change. In the early years, Virginia was a settlement of strangers, transient men, many of them ill-suited to the land, drifting between hunger and hardship. Marriage was not just desirable, it was essential for survival. But by the 1630s, Virginia had changed. It now had children, the first generation born on American soil. These sons and daughters, raised on the frontier, didn't need to be imported. They grew up working the land, hardened by the environment, and familiar with its dangers. Suddenly, there were native-born women of marriageable age, the daughters of early settlers, raised in English households. A homegrown marriage market began to take shape. The tobacco brides, once so urgently needed, were no longer the only option. The second factor was economic evolution. By the late 1620s, tobacco prices had become volatile. A boom in production led to oversupply, which drove prices down. What once made a man wealthy now barely covers debts. The 120-pound bride price became harder for average colonists to pay, and less attractive for investors. Tobacco was still profitable, but the frenzy had cooled. Planters sought cheaper labor, not expensive wives. And the company, now under strain, shifted its focus to indentured servitude and land expansion, bringing women across the ocean, outfitting them, and supervising their marriages. It was costly, complicated, and increasingly unnecessary. Then came tragedy. In March 1622, the Powhatan Confederacy launched a coordinated attack on English settlements, killing over 300 colonists in a single day. It was a devastating blow. Nearly one-third of the colony's population, entire communities were burned, farms destroyed, families slaughtered. The massacre shattered the illusion of safety. It exposed the colony's fragility and made clear that women, children, and unarmed settlers were vulnerable. After the attack, the Virginia Company paused bride shipments. Fewer women were willing to risk the journey. Even patriotic pamphlets and staged testimonials couldn't drown out the fear. In England, the image of Virginia shifted. It was no longer just a land of opportunity. It was a place of blood and fire. And then, in 1624, the Virginia Company itself collapsed, under pressure from investors and the crown shed by poor governance and financial failure. The company's charter was revoked. Virginia became a royal colony, now directly administered by the English crown. With crown change came a new onocus: military defense, administrative order, and trade regulation. Social engineering experiments, like the bride program, were quietly shelved. The state wanted a stable colony, not a laboratory for marriage reform. But the system didn't die completely. It evolved. Instead of shipping women across the ocean in bulk, the colony began encouraging immigration by family units. Incentives were offered to married couples. Land grants were given to settlers who arrived with wives and children. The idea was no longer to manufacture society from scratch, but to import it fully formed. And over time, the role of women in colonization changed. No longer marketed as commodities, they were now instruments of domestic expansion, expected to raise children, support homesteads, and ensure generational continuity. The transactional logic never disappeared. It simply repackaged itself. Meanwhile, other systems of labor and control expanded. Where English brides had once been the answer to colonial disorder, the rise of indentured servitude and eventually African slavery offered different, more brutal forms of social stability. The purchase of people did not stop. It just shifted its target, from women to workers, from wives to laborers, from colonists to captives. By 1650, the Tobacco Bride Program was a memory, barely mentioned in official records, rarely discussed in England. The women who had participated were absorbed into colonial society, their individual stories buried beneath household ledgers, baptismal rolls, and gravestones. Some had died in childbirth. Others had become matriarchs of sprawling families. A few returned home, broken or disillusioned. Most remained, building the foundations of a society that would forget how it began. But the program's legacy lived on. It revealed how marriage, one of the most personal and intimate institutions, could be transformed into a state tool. It showed how gender, like land, could be measured, priced, and moved to serve the empire. And it offered an early blueprint for how power structures, economic, racial, patriarchal, would shape every layer of American life to come. The program ended, but its logic endured. We remember Jamestown as the beginning, the first permanent English settlement in North America. a bold, rugged frontier. But buried beneath the myths of Pocahontas and John Smith, beneath the flags and forts, lies a quieter origin story. One where marriage was a transaction, love was negotiable, and women were currency in the making of a nation. The Tobacco Bride program ended nearly 400 years ago. But its logic, the idea that society can be shaped by controlling who marries, who reproduces, and who belongs, never truly disappeared. The women who boarded ships in the 1620s didn't leave behind memoirs. Most left no written words at all. Their voices were silenced by time, or perhaps never recorded to begin with. But their lives tell a story all the same. One not of romance, but of labor, survival, and sacrifice. These women were sold as solutions. They were the social infrastructure of the empire. They scrubbed blood from cabin floors. They buried babies. They cooked, bore children, stitched clothes, and planted wheat. And in return, they were remembered, if at all, as footnotes. The more profound legacy of the Tobacco Bride program lies in what it taught colonial society about gender, class, and value. It taught that marriage could be a state-engineered institution. It taught that women's bodies, their fertility, their labor, could be commodified for social stability. And it taught that belonging could be bought, but only by the right men. That logic shaped American policy for centuries. In the 1700s, colonial governments passed laws restricting who could marry based on race, class, and religion. Enslaved people were denied legal marriage entirely. Native marriages were erased or delegitimized by force. The hierarchy forged in Jamestown, where only white, property-owning men could access wives through economic power, expanded into a full-blown ideology. Even after the colonies became the United States, the control of marriage remained central to the state. Laws dictated who could marry, who couldn't, and what children counted as legitimate. Anti-miscegenation laws, immigration quotas based on family units, and property-based spousal rights all echo back to the foundations laid in Virginia. The Tobacco Bride experiment wasn't a blip, it was a template. In cultural memory, however, the story was scrubbed clean. Instead of acknowledging the colonial wife trade, popular history focused on tales of brave settlers, noble founding fathers, and exceptional women who willingly tamed the wilderness. The bride ships were reframed as romantic ventures. The transactional nature of it all was downplayed or forgotten. But fiction distorts. It creates myths of choice where there was only pressure. It creates narratives of love where there was only negotiation. And those myths shape our present more than we realize. To this day, marriage in America remains tied to power, to immigration status, to healthcare, to tax policy, to social legitimacy. We still incentivize marriage economically. We still police who should marry and who is allowed to form families. And we still carry romantic notions of frontier love that obscure the brutal calculations behind early American settlements. The Tobacco Bride program reminds us that for many women, the promise of family was not a reward. It was a price paid for survival. But there is another legacy too. One found not in ledgers or contracts, but in quiet defiance. Among the women who refused to marry, in those who fled into the woods, in those who chose love later, on their own terms, or raised children in homes that defied the colonial mold. Their stories are harder to find, because resistance doesn't always leave paperwork. But they remind us that even in systems built on control, there is always humanity. The Tobacco Wives are part of America's foundation, not by myth, but by fact. They remind us that women were not just present at the beginning of the colonial project. They were used to structure it. And yet, despite the constraints, they also helped shape the first families, the first communities, and ultimately the first whispers of a new nation. We owe it to them and to ourselves to tell the whole story. Not just of the men who carved empires from the wilderness, but of the women who were shipped into it. Not just of freedom, but of what it cost.